A respected judge delivers a 60-year sentence to a young man he believes is guilty, but when a forgotten piece of evidence resurfaces, it reveals a web of corruption so deep it shakes the justice system to its core. The courtroom was packed that day in Fresno, California. The air was heavy, not just with the summer heat, but with the weight of the decision about to be delivered. All eyes were fixed on Judge Malcolm Brewer, a man whose reputation preceded him. He wasn't known for compassion or second chances. His judgments were swift, firm, and by all accounts, unshakable. At 62, with 35 years on the bench, his face was as chiseled as his rulings, a testament to the countless lives he had altered with the swing of his gavel. The defendant, 24-year-old Ryan Hale, stood at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly, but his gaze steady. He wore the kind of expression that comes from a lifetime of trying to prove yourself. Ryan had always maintained his innocence, even during his arrest for the armed robbery of a jewelry store that left one man critically injured. But today, his voice wouldn't matter. "Mr. Hale," Judge Brewer began, his deep baritone filling the room, "you stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were not only reckless but calculated, and you have shown no remorse." Ryan's mother, seated in the back row, stifled a sob. She had begged the court to see him as more than a case number, to consider the boy she had raised, the boy who once dreamed of becoming a firefighter. But the evidence had spoken louder. Eyewitness accounts, surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip that had sealed his fate. "I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison," Judge Brewer declared, his gavel striking the oak block. The sound echoed, final and absolute. Ryan stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if holding back words he knew would never change anything. The room erupted, gasps, whispers, and the shuffle of reporters jotting notes. But for Ryan, the world had gone silent. He turned to look at his mother one last time before being led away, his shackled footsteps fading down the hall. Judge Brewer returned to his chambers, shutting the door against the noise. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring into the swirling liquid as if it held some answer. The day had been long, but justice, as he saw it, had been served. Or so he thought. Little did he know the truth he had just buried would soon come clawing its way to the surface, refusing to stay hidden. The trial had been one for the books. Local news outlets dubbed it the Hale robbery case, and it dominated headlines for weeks. The crime itself was a spectacle. A masked gunman storming into Carter's Jewelers in downtown Fresno on a busy Thursday afternoon, brandishing a weapon, and making off with over $150,000 in stolen goods. The chaos left one store clerk, Samuel Gaines, fighting for his life after being struck in the crossfire. Ryan Hale, a part-time mechanic with no prior criminal record, had been arrested 2 weeks after the robbery. An anonymous caller tipped off authorities, claiming Ryan fit the description of the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution painted a damning picture, connecting him to the stolen goods recovered from a storage unit registered under his name. Ryan's court-appointed defense attorney struggled to make headway against the mountain of evidence. There was the grainy surveillance footage showing a man with a similar build and gait, eyewitnesses who swore they recognized Ryan's voice, and perhaps most incriminating of all, fingerprints found on the weapon left behind at the scene. Still, Ryan maintained his innocence. "I didn't do this," he told the jury during his testimony. "I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun." His alibi, a claim that he was working a double shift at the auto shop that day, crumbled under scrutiny when his boss admitted on the stand that he couldn't verify Ryan's whereabouts for the full day. The prosecution's closing arguments were as sharp as they were unforgiving. "This is a man who thought he could outsmart the law," the district attorney declared, pacing before the jury. "But the evidence doesn't lie. The fingerprints don't lie. The witnesses don't lie." In contrast, Ryan's defense felt feeble, almost defeated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," his lawyer pleaded, "there are holes in this case. Doubts. Isn't that enough to give this young man the benefit of the doubt?" But his voice lacked conviction, and the jury wasn't swayed. The deliberation was swift, less than 3 hours. The verdict? Guilty on all counts. Ryan didn't flinch as the foreperson read the decision, but the tightening of his jaw betrayed the storm brewing inside. Judge Brewer, impartial as ever, prepared himself to deliver a sentence he felt was justified. He had seen hardened criminals in his courtroom, men who had mastered the art of manipulation. To him, Ryan was no different. His gaze swept the courtroom before landing on Ryan, as if searching for any sign of remorse or redemption. When the sentence was handed down, it was as if the room itself exhaled. For the victims and their families, there was relief. For Ryan and his mother, devastation. The system had spoken, and it was unforgiving. But as Judge Brewer signed the sentencing papers later that evening, a faint flicker of something unsettled him, a nagging sense he couldn't quite place. He dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue. What Judge Brewer couldn't know was that the trial had been just the beginning. The real story was waiting for him, hidden in plain sight, and it was about to change everything. It started on an unremarkable Wednesday evening. Judge Brewer sat in his study, the warm glow of a desk lamp illuminating the cluttered stacks of legal briefs and case files. Retirement had been on his mind lately, but tonight there was work to be done. A new case involving police misconduct had landed on his desk, and the allegations were serious enough to warrant extra attention. As he thumbed through the documents, something caught his eye, an evidence log from a prior investigation. At first it was just a passing glance, a meaningless detail in the sea of paperwork. But then a name leapt out at him. Ryan Hale. Brewer sat back in his chair, frowning. It wasn't unusual for names to resurface in unrelated cases, but this felt different. He flipped the page, his pulse quickening. The log detailed the inventory of a police evidence locker, listing items confiscated during a separate robbery investigation that had taken place around the same time as the Carter's Jewelers case. One item stood out: a gun. The description matched the weapon used in the robbery for which Ryan had been convicted. The problem? This gun hadn't been submitted as evidence during Ryan's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Brewer leaned forward, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the trial document still fresh in his memory. It was an exact match. Same make, same scratches on the barrel. But the report claimed this gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. "How is that possible?" he muttered under his breath. His heart raced as he pieced together the implications. If this gun had been in police custody, it couldn't have been used in the Carter's Jewelers robbery. And if it wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints were on it? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Brewer had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of the legal system, and he knew how easily critical details could be buried. But this wasn't a mistake. It felt intentional. Determined to get answers, he requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. It arrived the next morning, a thick folder brimming with police reports, photographs and witness statements. The deeper Brewer dug, the more the threads began to unravel. The arresting officer in the unrelated case was the same detective who had testified during Ryan's trial. And then there was the anonymous tip. Brewer had barely given it a second thought during the trial, but now it seemed glaringly suspicious. He requested a subpoena for the tip line records, his unease growing with every passing hour. When the documents finally arrived, Brewer's blood ran cold. The call hadn't come from a random citizen. It had originated from a burner phone registered under the same detective's name. The walls of his office seemed to close in as the realization hit him. Ryan Hale had been set up. The evidence had been manipulated. The testimony orchestrated. Brewer's stomach churned as he thought about the 60-year sentence he had handed down, the shattered life of a young man who might have been innocent all along. Brewer had always prided himself on upholding the law, but now the law felt like quicksand beneath his feet. He knew what had to be done, but the path forward was fraught with peril. As the weight of his discovery settled, Brewer made a choice. He would dig deeper, no matter the cost. The truth demanded it, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Judge Brewer hadn't slept much since uncovering the discrepancies in Ryan Hale's case. His mornings began with stacks of legal documents, and his nights ended with a notebook full of hastily scribbled notes. But the more he investigated, the darker the picture became. The first crack in the wall came when Brewer met with an old colleague, retired investigator Daniel Hayes. Over coffee in a dimly lit diner off Highway 99, Brewer laid out his findings. Hayes, a man with a no-nonsense demeanor and a knack for sniffing out corruption, listened intently. "This isn't just negligence, Malcolm," Hayes said, pushing his coffee mug aside. "If what you're saying is true, someone went to great lengths to make sure that kid took the fall." Brewer nodded grimly. "I need proof, Dan. Solid proof." Hayes agreed to help, and within days the two were neck-deep in police records, witness testimonies, and internal memos. What they found was staggering: falsified reports, missing evidence logs, and witness statements that had been altered to align with the prosecution's narrative. One witness in particular caught Brewer's attention: a store clerk who had initially identified another man as the suspect, before later changing his statement to implicate Ryan. Hayes tracked the man down to a small apartment on the edge of town. When they confronted him, his story came tumbling out. "I didn't want to do it," the man confessed, his hands trembling. "But Detective Lewis, he pressured me. Said if I didn't, I'd be arrested for obstruction. I didn't have a choice." Detective Lewis. The name sent a wave of anger through Brewer. This was the same officer who had submitted the false tip and concealed the evidence. As Brewer and Hayes dug deeper, they uncovered a pattern. Lewis had a history of questionable tactics, intimidating witnesses, fabricating evidence, and coercing confessions. Yet his record remained spotless, protected by layers of bureaucratic red tape. The breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Lewis's police account. One email in particular stood out. It was addressed to the district attorney and detailed a plan to ensure a conviction in the Carter's Jewelers case. Attached was a list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements. Brewer felt a surge of rage as he read the email. The very system he had devoted his life to was rotten to its core. And yet there was no time for despair. He had the proof he needed to act. But exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Lewis had powerful allies within the department, and Brewer knew that going public could cost him everything: his career, his reputation, even his safety. Yet, as he thought of Ryan Hale sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, the decision was clear. "We go public," Brewer told Hayes one night as they reviewed their findings, "no matter what it takes." The next day, Brewer filed a motion to reopen Ryan's case, attaching the damning evidence against Lewis. The motion sent shockwaves through the courthouse, but Brewer wasn't done. He also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Lewis and the Fresno Police Department. The backlash was swift. Brewer received anonymous threats, warning him to back off. His colleagues distanced themselves, and the media began to question his motives. But Brewer stood firm. The truth was out now, and there was no turning back. But as the storm grew around him, Brewer realized that the fight was far from over. The hardest battles were yet to come. The fallout from Judge Brewer's motion was immediate and explosive. Local headlines screamed accusations of corruption within the Fresno Police Department, and public outrage spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, Brewer felt the heat of scrutiny aimed directly at him. Some called him a hero for seeking justice, others labeled him a traitor to the system he'd sworn to uphold. But it wasn't just public opinion that turned against him. Brewer began receiving phone calls at odd hours, heavy silence on the other end before the line went dead. One morning, he stepped outside to find his car tires slashed. A crude note scrawled on the windshield: "Drop it, or else." Brewer knew the risks of pursuing the truth, but he hadn't expected the threats to escalate so quickly. Still, he refused to be intimidated. He'd seen too many lives ruined by the kind of systemic failures he was now confronting. Ryan Hale's face haunted his thoughts: young, determined, and heartbreakingly resigned to a fate he hadn't deserved. Meanwhile, Detective Lewis wasn't going down without a fight. Through his attorney, Lewis denied the allegations, claiming Brewer's motion was a baseless attack aimed at tarnishing his career. "This is nothing more than a vendetta," Lewis declared in a televised interview, his polished demeanor a stark contrast to the growing evidence against him. Brewer watched the interview from his living room, his jaw tightening with frustration. The lies were bold and calculated, but he had something Lewis didn't: the truth. As the investigation progressed, Hayes unearthed a critical piece of evidence: security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store, recorded on the day of the robbery. The footage, which had somehow never been submitted during the trial, showed a man matching Lewis's physical description leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Brewer's heart pounded as he reviewed the tape. It wasn't just exculpatory, it was damning. With this, the pieces fell into place. The robbery hadn't been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated by Lewis himself. The next step was clear but dangerous. Brewer called for an emergency hearing to present the new evidence. The courtroom was tense as the footage played on a screen before the packed gallery. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the realization sank in. "This man," Brewer said, gesturing to the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Ryan Hale. He manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The reaction was immediate. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their flashes illuminating the courtroom like strobe lights. Lewis, sitting in the gallery with his lawyer, looked pale, but defiant. "You're making a mistake, Brewer," he hissed as he was escorted out in handcuffs. "You don't know what you've started." The confrontation left Brewer shaken but resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Ryan Hale's conviction was being re-examined. But Brewer knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a much larger battle. As the courtroom emptied, Brewer realized the weight of what he'd uncovered. The truth was out, but the fight for justice was far from over. Weeks later, Judge Brewer sat in the same courtroom where Ryan Hale had been sentenced, but this time, the air felt different. The gallery was packed with reporters, activists, and Ryan's family, all waiting for the judge presiding over the retrial to make a decision. Ryan, now thinner and visibly aged from his time in prison, sat quietly at the defense table. Despite the ordeal, his posture was steady, his gaze unwavering. Brewer felt a lump form in his throat as he watched the young man who had been the center of this storm, who had endured so much for a crime he hadn't committed. The evidence Brewer and Hayes had unearthed was irrefutable. The surveillance footage, falsified reports, coerced testimonies. It all pointed to a web of corruption that had framed Ryan and shielded the real criminals. As the presiding judge announced the decision to overturn Ryan's conviction, the room erupted in applause and tears. Ryan stood, his hands trembling as his mother rushed to embrace him. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Brewer, seated quietly in the back of the courtroom, allowed himself a rare smile. Justice had finally been served, but the journey had come at a cost. In the days that followed, the fallout spread far and wide. Detective Lewis faced criminal charges for his actions, and an independent investigation into the Fresno Police Department revealed a culture of corruption that had gone unchecked for years. The case sparked nationwide calls for reform, with Brewer's role becoming a rallying cry for accountability within the justice system. Despite the accolades, Brewer remained introspective. He knew this victory was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The system he had once trusted was flawed, but it wasn't beyond repair, and he was determined to spend the rest of his career fighting to make it better. As for Ryan, his journey was only beginning. Freed from the burden of a wrongful conviction, he vowed to dedicate his life to helping others who had been unjustly imprisoned. His story became a beacon of hope for those who believed in the power of resilience and the pursuit of truth. The story of Ryan Hale and Judge Brewer is a powerful reminder that justice is not infallible. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. If this story moved you, consider supporting organizations that work to free the wrongfully convicted and advocate for systemic reform. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire and challenge the way we see the world. Because sometimes the fight for justice doesn't end in the courtroom. It begins there.